So we're going to dive right in. When I told my wife that we were doing a panel on the future of civil society, she said, "Oh, I know exactly how that will go," in one word. And that word began with F, and I can't repeat it right here. And sometimes I feel that way too. I can be pessimistic. I think a lot of us can be. So I wanted to start with a positive. I wanted to start with what are the basic principles of civil society. And as is the custom in civil societies, we're going to start with ladies first, not to put you on the spot. But the basic principles of civil society, and I'd like to get an answer from everybody here. Just a reminder that we need to be pretty concise because we are way too limited. I wish we'd go on for hours. All right, so Ayaan, if you don't mind, the basic principles of civil society.
I'll start with manners. I don't know if
Your jacket is covering your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'll start with manners, good manners, enforced kindness.
A little closer.
Manners, good manners, enforced kindness. And then I'll pass it on. I know that we're short on time. I think we'll get an opportunity to explain and to dig deeper into that. But if we can disagree with one another and make our perspectives clear, I think everybody's okay to attack my viewpoint, my perspective, my ideas. But if we are kind enough to one another, civil enough to one another to say, we begin with the good faith basis, that I'm not going to condemn the person when I don't like the message. And I think in short, Voltaire had said, I'm going to paraphrase it, I despise or I condemn what you stand for, but I will defend to the death that you have the right to say it.
Thank you very much. Tim?
Well, the Latin for the word civilization or civilized comes from the Latin that shares the root with city, right? And so these are the virtues or values that go with city living, civilian life. And I'm reminded there's a chapter in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire where Gibbon talks about how civilization could never grow up among sheep herders. And it's a marvelous thing. I know Decline and Fall is one of those books that intimidates everybody. It's actually delightful to read, very easy to read, marvelous book. And he talks about how he distinguishes between the life in the city and the life of the nomad. And the virtues that go into civilized society are those that have recently been labeled by the sociologist Deirdre McCloskey the bourgeois virtues. And bourgeois is another word that comes from city. It's the bourgeois comes from the same root as burg, as in Pittsburgh, for instance, right? And so these are the values and virtues that go into city living, which is, you don't settle your disputes by violence. You have a freedom of speech where you negotiate and argue. You respect people's private property. You respect entrepreneurialism and independence of mind and cooperation and diversity and so forth. So that's what I would say are the roots of civil society.
Right?
I will piggyback on that a little bit. I certainly agree that the idea of civility or civilized society means what are the principles by which we can live together harmoniously rather than in violence. So that's what it means. Well, what are I'll say there are two principles. I'll echo Ayn Rand characteristic of me. And I believe that they are that reason is our only means of knowledge. Faith is not a means of knowledge. Emotions are not a means of knowledge. Emotions are extremely important in human life, but they don't tell you what's true and false, right and wrong. And faith is really just going by emotion. It's the idea that I believe this because I want to. That is not civil action epistemologically. That is pretending that something is your means of knowledge when you know it isn't. So reason is our means of knowledge. That's really important because that undergirds everything else. The second principle I would say is that no one may initiate the use of physical force against other people. Why? Because force used against human beings stops them from being able to act on their rational judgment, which is their means of living. So these two go hand in hand. reason is our means of knowledge. Therefore, it's our basic means of living. It's how we figure out what things are, what we can do to put things together to create the values that we need. Everything from food, clothing, and shelter to the spiritual values, self-esteem, purpose, and freedom. So,
Well, there's virtually nothing left. I'll pick up with what Ayaan, Timothy, and Craig said. I'll get a little more granular. The Latin from Cicero, when he used that as societas civilis, which means civil society, and he lived around the time of Christ. We traffic in two meanings of the term. One is civil discourse, basically means no ad hominem arguments and listen to people, and hopefully people will listen to you. It's kind of reciprocity and civil conversation and conversation. And then we have a deeper, more profound meaning, and it's the way that the glue, if you will, that holds civilizations and societies together. And so what that glue is, and if you can have a civil society, actually I think this would be an interesting conversation if we have a moment. Can the foundational principles of society not be based on reason and rationality, and can you still have a civil society? So the word civil, I think, is fraught with a little bit of assumptions about what that means. About everybody in their own society has a kind of myopia in terms of thinking that the values that they have adopted in the society should be universalized and adopted by everyone. And I think a little care is necessary, particularly with the word civil.
Very interesting, thank you. And we're going to loop back through, and I'd like to talk now about the biggest threats that you see to civil society today. We're talking about many of them already throughout this conference. So what do you think are the biggest? And we'll start with you, Ayaan.
I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll say, first of all, we're talking about a particular civil society. We're not talking about all civil societies. We're not talking about all civilizations, etc., etc. We're talking about ours, America, for instance, maybe Western civilization, if you want to extend it. The biggest threat, in my view, is not external. By that I mean when it comes to our economy, our military, our institutions, we are superior, and I think if we have the glue that Peter talked about, we can fend off those external threats. Internally, I think we're seeing maybe a disintegration in confidence. We are in a place in America, it looks like that to me, where we want to go from being the most advanced society to listening to our most primal and primitive and tribal, you mentioned the word emotion, but impulses. People in America are now at a place where they don't just disagree with the other, it's to destroy the other. And if you let that impulse prevail, I don't care what narrative you cover it with or coat it with, but if you let that narrative prevail, then you're destroying it, weakening it from within, and then it makes it very easy for external forces to come in and take over. Gibbons.
Great, Tim?
I think that we are, in America, we are, and I certainly agree with the internal threat, that we are much greater risk of fascism in the United States right now than we are of communism or socialism in its traditional leftist varieties. There's really, I don't think, any appetite for the wholesale confiscation of property and things like that in the United States, but historically speaking, fascism has tended to thrive as a reaction to leftist provocation. So the left comes in and says, we're going to radically re-alter society, and traditionalists then exploit that as an opportunity to impose traditionalist values in the form of fascist control. And there's a very fine book out there by a fellow named Robert Paxton called The Roots of Fascism, and I brought this along to share. This is his definition of fascism. He emphasized that fascism is really more like a group of passions or emotional impulses than it is a thought-out ideological program, although there is certainly an ideological program to fascism, but it's more of like an impulse. And here's what he says are the symptoms of fascism: a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of traditional solutions, the primacy of the group to which one has duties superior to every right, the belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits, dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, or alien influences, the need for a closer integration of a purer community, by consent if possible, but by violence if necessary, the need for authority by natural chiefs, always male, culminating in a national chieftain who alone is capable of incarnating the group's historical destiny, the superiority of that leader's instincts over abstract reason, the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will, and the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, right being decided by the sole criterion of the group's prowess in a Darwinian struggle. That is a very apt description, I think, of what is going on, particularly in certain segments of the American right today, and that frightens me a lot more. Now, I should say, I think a lot of what passes for the left today is actually the right, and vice versa. So the wokeness on campus and so forth, I think, is a species of puritanical attitude that in past generations would have been characterized as a rightist attitude. But we associate it with the left today because it's in the service of things like racial equality and so forth. But it's fundamentally a puritanical and ultra-conservative or reactionary movement. And at its heart, it's a totalitarian movement. While I have you all captive, I will urge you to pick up the little cards. One of the little cards I put out there on the table, it has a little QR code you can scan to take you to what the Goldwater Institute is doing to fight back against wokeism on campus and these things that we were talking about. So please pick one of these up when you have a chance.
So again, I'll piggyback on that. I think that description of fascism, in particular the tribalist element that manifests from the other elements, I want to address what makes that possible. What makes it possible for that to become so popular in a society that once didn't have that once had the American spirit of individualism, can-doism, and individual rights. And I think that what is the cause there is a lack, and the lack is of an understanding of what a secular, objective understanding of what rights are, where they come from, and how we know it. Because in the discussions about who has a right to do what today, we have this bizarre false alternative. Rights come from God, and whatever He says is going to go. Well, at the very least, there's no evidence for God. There is no God, but there's no evidence for Him, so that's why nobody's ever proven it. So somebody down here is going to speak to what you have a right to do if you're going with that model. The other model is that rights come from government. Whatever government says you can do, you can do. But that's to equate rights with laws. That's to conflate the two, and they're not the same thing. Rights are supposed to tell us what governments and laws can properly do or be. It's not supposed to be equated with those things. It comes before them. As the founder said, governments are formulated to protect rights, not to create them. And then we get to the third, what seems like a great alternative, that rights are natural, but the problem is the natural rights theorists have almost invariably not really been natural rights theorists, because they say that rights come from a moral law, and if you ask and press, where does that moral law come from? Well, it comes from God. In other words, they're not natural rights theorists, they're supernatural rights theorists. Because of this, almost no one in this country or the rest of the civilized world has any idea what rights are. Well, how are you going to address questions of property rights, abortion rights, or any other kind of rights when you don't know what these things are? So this concept is what Ayn Rand called a floating abstraction. It's just everybody's using it, and nobody knows what anchors it to reality. So I think education about what rights are and where they come from, and about what individualism is as contrasted with collectivism, and that's all in the same sphere anyway. That is one of the big problems today.
I have a very, very different answer. I think that there's a primary, secondary, and with all due respect, I think what you described, in my view, is a tertiary concern. The secondary concern is institutional and ideological capture of our engines of knowledge production, of our universities. Secondary concerns would also be things like social media, the divisiveness in society, but even those can be overcome. Here's the primary concern. The primary concern is that we have forgotten what has made us great. We have forgotten what has made this country amazing, what Ayaan talked about today and her experiences of coming to the United States. We have forgotten what it means to be a shining city on a hill. We have forgotten fundamental values, due process, Miranda rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And as a consequence, we don't know why those values are worth fighting for. So it's a type of either valuing the wrong things. I don't think it's an educational problem, although I think that's part of it. I think it's a problem of values. We have stopped valuing those things that will lead to our cohesion as a society. And the moment that we have stopped valuing, it starts with bickering, and then it progresses from there. Oh, and one more thing I just wanted to say. I just want to pick up on something Timothy said. I don't think that wokeness in the service of woke ideology is on the right, because I don't think that it's a very small nitpick, but it's an extremely substantive difference. It's not in the fight for equality, it's in the fight for equity. It's a values-based concern, and we have to be very careful that we're not hoodwinked by those words.
Any follow-up on that before I pose another question for Peter on that?
Yes, just a clarification. Apparently. Did you do the last few words? I think I missed them. Did you say it's not in the fight for equality,
Correct.
but in the fight for equity?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Just want to make sure I had heard that.
Yeah, so those terms are actually opposite to each other. So we can talk about, you moderate, you can talk about it if you want. But yes, it's not equality, don't be hoodwinked, it's equity. It's redistribution, it's equality, it's not equality of opportunity, it's equality of outcome.
I would like to follow up on that now that I know what he said, because I really agree on this count, but I think you can break it down a little further to help on this. I call this the equality equivocation, because equality comes in many forms. You can have equality of outcomes, you can have equality of opportunity, you can have equality before the law, or you can have equal protection of individual rights. Those are all different things. And so this throwing around of the word equality without knowing what it means
Totally,
is just
100%.
chaos. Yeah.
And I wanted to, that's intentional by design.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, interestingly, this kind of plays into, as a sociological matter, watching the process by which what I've said is essentially a fascist trend in the culture. Watching it happen is kind of interesting. And today's Supreme Court decision in the abortion case gives kind of a subtle example of this, and that is the focus on history, the incredible focus on history in the majority opinion. I'm sure you all ran out during the 15-minute break and read all 200 pages of the opinion. But what Justice Alito says there is the rights that the Constitution protects in the Due Process Clause. The Due Process Clause protects liberty. What does liberty mean? What does liberty mean? That's a philosophical question, right? And as a philosophical question, it requires a conceptual breakdown of what is human nature, what does it require, what is the purpose of the state, these sorts of things, those big philosophical questions. And what Alito says in the majority opinion is we're not going to engage in that kind of thing. Instead, we will look at tradition. And so, and our answer is purely drawn from history and traditionalism. And I think that's one little example of what I'm talking about this move away from what you might broadly call the liberal pursuit of philosophical understanding of where do rights come from as a philosophical matter, as an objective matter, and moving away from that. And what else do you have? If you refuse to engage in philosophy, what else have you got? You've either got complete randomness, or what our tribe has always done, which we call deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. That's what that phrase means in constitutional law. And so we turn to history, and then therefore whatever was okay in 1787 is okay today, and whatever was not okay in 1787 is not okay today. And that's actually a form of relativism, right? That's a way of not talking about morality. Then it's just, well, we'll just push off the question by saying whatever the founding fathers thought, that's good enough for us, which is a betrayal of what the Constitution actually means, masquerading as true constitutional law, and that's called originalism.
Come back to the American legal landscape in just a second. I want to pick up on a thread from Peter's answer just a moment ago. I think you said that it's a values problem and not an educational problem, if I heard you correctly. And I was a little surprised to hear that because it seems to me, outside looking in, that a key source of the most illiberal ideas today are the colleges, specifically the humanities departments, which are teaching much about politics and values. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more whether or not you think there's a definite divide there between education and values, or not.
I'm not sure I understand your question. What do you mean?
Well, if it's not an educational problem, it's a values problem, where are these values being taught?
Okay, so this is a really hard pill to swallow, but most people don't believe things on the basis of evidence. They believe things because they want to be a good person, and they believe that good people believe this. You mentioned God and religion, this falls into this category. Most people hold their beliefs for moral and not epistemological reasons. That's why the wokeism is particularly interesting right now, because in Socrates, as Plato's Theaetetus, for example, he talks about what does it mean to know something. And he basically says it's justified true belief. Basically, you have to have a good reason for believing something, you have to believe it, and it has to be true. One of the things that we're experiencing right now, particularly with ideological capture of our institutions, is that the problem has gone from an epistemological problem, oh, this person believes that because he doesn't have enough information, to a moral problem. This person believes that because they're bad people, because they want to support the patriarchy, or because they want to use the N-word, or because they want to do something else. And it would behoove us, and this is not the time or place to do it, to understand the academic and scholastic underpinnings of this. So among the ideas are privilege-preserving epistemic pushback. It's basically a big word, means that privilege seeks to preserve itself. Maleness seeks to preserve itself. Whiteness seeks to preserve itself. So that's why I said they have a linguistic and scholastic infrastructure in place that is designed to disrupt. There's a whole vein of literature on disrupting, because they don't view civilization, to many of my former colleagues, is that which must be overturned, not for the collective good, but as an equity-based model to, and not even to bring in fairness, but to bring in, to raise the voices of those people who have been historically marginalized. So what do we have now? We have organizational capture of our institutions, particularly our colleges of education. I can't go into the public school. Nobody can just walk into the public schools and teach. You have to have a teaching certificate. All of those, and this is relating to the opposite of what Timothy said, all of those teaching certificates or college of education are predicated upon a single book. One book, just one. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He was a Brazilian educator. The purpose of the institution, academic institutions, is not to seek truth. North Star is not the truth. It's to overcome oppression. So even if you had a wand and you waved it, and all of illiberalism and censoriousness was suddenly vaporized from our K through 12 system, it would be totally irrelevant. It would just repopulate, because people with colleges, from colleges of education with teaching degrees would just go back in there. So as Ayaan said today in her talk, we are sowing the seeds of our own destruction. We do not need to worry about, well, maybe a little bit, the Russians and disinformation. I guess the Russians have their own problems right now, but we don't need to worry about external threats more than what we need to be concerned about what our kids are learning. They're walking into classrooms when people are convinced that they have the right answers to moral questions. They're testing them on those questions. Those kids are going out into the workforce. They're becoming leaders, administrators, and educators, and they're dissolving the culture from within. So it's not that the ACLU, real quick, it's not that the ACLU has just lost its mission. Its mission is the same. But the people discharging the mission and the SPLC, those people have grown up indoctrinated into a system.
Thank you so much, Peter. And coming back to you, you've compared wokeism to Islam, and I'd love to hear what you think unifies these things.
I think wokeism is a product. Wokeism is a product of Western civilization. It is, in my view, yes, everything everybody here said. Can't even turn that on. Okay, is that better?
You're doing everything correctly, but I think we might need to have the handheld turned up. Number 12.
Number 12, yeah. So English is not my first language, and I have an accent, and so you got to turn it up to number 12. Very rational. I think I agree with everyone on the panel, but I've been on panels like this either as a participant or in your capacity as a member of the audience, and I listen to, say, the four of you speak, and I don't necessarily hear disagreements, but I do sense that there is a siloing. The last question you asked, it's not a values problem, it's an education problem. Okay, and then in my primitive tribal brain, it goes, what is the difference? What on earth is education about if it's not imparting values? And you talked about originalism, and it was original to what? And you talk about traditions, and so if you're sitting in the audience and you listen to all of us, you think that there are disagreements, and I think there are authentic, serious disagreements between all of us here, but not on the things that actually matter, not on the aspect of the glue. So for me, as a relative newcomer to Western society, I think even the very fact that you're sitting here in your suits peacefully and talking about these disagreements, that's what makes Western civilization distinct. Thank you. That you have a woman on stage along with the men. Very often I think, I'm not quite sure anymore if that's a good thing, but okay. I will explain at some point. I know, I could be beheaded by the woke, seriously. I'm not always sure that you should have a woman on the panel for the sake of it. If you think she really has something to say or not to say, fine. Or you should say, you shouldn't, this tokenism of diversity, I think that needs to go. So I don't take, thank you. I don't take, me taking this seat, or I'm representing women. I'm doing no such thing.
I feel like the four of us are the tokens.
You probably are in the current climate.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, you are in the current climate because according to wokeism, the only group of people in America whom you can discriminate against, you can call them deplorables, you can accuse them of everything that's wrong and bad. It's white men, and if you're white and you're male, and God forbid you're heterosexual, you ought to be burned on the stake. So you probably are. You are the tokens. So I don't see me sitting here as being a token. But I can tell you, I mean, it is, I did that piece in the Wall Street Journal about what are the differences and the similarities between Islamism and wokeism. And reading it again today, I think I used the criteria developed in the West to make these distinctions. That we're able to have these conversations is distinctly Western, and you have to understand that. So when you go, you know, originalism versus Roe versus Wade, I think, you know, tell me about a non-Western society where reproductive rights are debated the way we debate them, or transgender. I mean, most human beings really don't understand that and include me in there. And on it goes. Cities, you talked about cities and the mores in cities. Well, the mores in cities, can I break the bad news to you? This wokeist nonsense is not coming from the countryside. It's not coming from flyover country. It's coming from the cities. So there is something that's going on inside Western cities that is irrational. And in its most irrational manifestation, it's a rejection of its very own roots. I was born and raised a Muslim, and every single Muslim, and you will be my witness because, you're also an ex-Muslim like myself, you're taken back over and over again. This is who you are. Even if you don't face Mecca 5 times a day, even if you don't pray, even if you don't believe in Muhammad, but still it's your civilization. You're a traitor and you're claiming to go outside. You can't say that in Christianity anymore. So I don't care if you believe in Jesus Christ and the Trinity, etc., but this, what America is an outcome of Christian tradition.
Thank you.
If I can, so I've been thinking a lot, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my presentation. I've been thinking a lot about the American West in recent years. And you mentioned in your talk earlier that you used the phrase, the romantic desire to be primitive, which motivates a lot of this wokeism. And it's the Rousseauian core of that. And it's this hostility to the principle of civilizing, to the process of civilizing, which is what went on in the American West in the 19th century. And I actually wrote a little piece about this for the Objective Standard a couple years ago about the Western films, that there's this real change in how Western films, I mean cowboy films, how they were portrayed, how they appeared. And it occurred right around 1968, right? That's when The Wild Bunch appeared. Before The Wild Bunch, these Western films were movies like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, the greatest Western film ever made. Better than The Searchers, I'm sorry. Which is about the settlement of the American West, right? And what are the virtues and values that, and now it has a perspective on that I actually disagree with, but it's a very beautifully done perspective on what does it take to civilize the wilderness. And civilizing the wilderness requires, as Rand says for the New Intellectual, I think it is, she says, it requires the principle, gentlemen, leave your guns outside. She says in Western films, you often see they go into the bar and the bartender says, gentlemen, leave your guns outside. That's the core principle that makes civilization and the city and civil society possible in the wilderness. And freedom of speech depends on a mutual acceptance of leave your guns outside. And it's funny, when Professor Boghossian was going to say the one book that everything's based on, I thought you were going to say Zinn. Because I was taught Howard Zinn. How many of you students out there were taught from Howard Zinn? Oh, a surprisingly low amount. I guess they would be self-selected. They wouldn't show up with it.
How many were taught history at all?
That's a good question.
But Zinn represents this, history from the bottom up, equalize the dispossessed, speak for the victim. That's the phrases that are used. But what it really means is the desire for the primitive, the desire to break down those virtues that make civilization possible in the Rousseauian total fantasy. I mean, it's a total illusion. It's a delusion that somehow a pre-civil barbaric society is somehow more equal or more peaceful or more in harmony and stuff like that. And Rand referred to that as the anti-industrial revolution, that motivated the New Left, and that gave voice in Western films, in The Wild Bunch, and has been seen in Western films ever since then. This viewing of the cowboy as the bad guy is just one tiny cultural manifestation of this hostility to the civilizing virtues, and that's why the cities are being burned down by their own denizens, because the cities are filled with people who are anti-civilization.
And in short, it is the civilizing of the male, of men. And if you look at Western society, again, what makes it distinct today, and I think puts it in a crisis spot, is there is no spot, no place, no association for the young male. He's not allowed to be himself. Peter and I were at the University of Texas, Austin, and again, I think of it as a privilege. I was invited to the dinner on Thursday night, and I was invited by, yes, all the others were men. And what did they do? They went to a Brazilian restaurant that serves excessive amounts of meat, and they were drinking excessive amounts of alcohol after a long, hard week of work, and they were just being men. And I could observe them, and they were shouting, they were talking, and there was a lot of noise. And as a female, I thought, wow, they looked happy. You guys looked good. And that was the start. Like, they need to have their own spot without the distraction of women. And thank you for letting me in. Thank you for giving me permission to observe. But early on in the evening, I thought, I want to go. I've got, it's not I felt like an intruder. I didn't belong there. But, as a woman, if I want to go talk nonsense with my girlfriends, I have that. I have all sorts of female associations. Every single minority you could dream up has its own place. But young male Americans don't have a place of their own. Not in university, now no longer in corporations. We've invaded their clubs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that has to be reversed.
We're going to go to... No man show. That's right. We had Ayaan Hirsi Ali here yesterday.
Yeah.
I want to go to Craig in just a second, but just interesting cultural difference insight here. My wife is from Brazil. What you're talking about is a churrascaria, and she would be right there with the guys, with the caipirinhas and the meat. So, there are cultural differences, and Craig had something to say.
I think it's fine to be together. I just don't think they just don't have a place to go. Let me put it something. It's voluntarily, yeah, right, let's mix. But there are places where I think we've imposed and invaded their male spaces that there is no way that a Peter Boghossian can inspire and train and just relate to a younger man in a way that's not interrupted by, distracted, and intervened with all sorts of, female and feminine stuff. And I think maybe we're onto something.
So I just want to say a few words, partially in agreement with an earlier statement from Ayaan and partially in disagreement, because I think there's a bit of a package deal of putting together of things that don't belong, or maybe better to say just some distinction that needs to be made. So Ayaan said that that America was born of a Christian tradition, or a Christian history, or Christian culture. Judeo-Christian, yes. And in a sense that's true, and in another sense it isn't, and I think distinguishing these senses is important. And an easy way to do this is by just looking at John Locke, who is the father of liberalism, certainly huge influence on the founders in terms of rights theory. So John Locke, in his second treatise, where he talks about property rights and what rights are and where they come from, he has two different approaches in that same short tract. In one case, he says, rights come from God. God made you, I didn't make you, and because God made you, you have to do his will. I can't make you do my will. Okay, so that's a religious case for rights. In the same book, he basically says, if you dig stuff out of the ground and make something of it, because you made that thing is yours. One of his examples, if you shoot a deer, you convert that deer from being a wild animal to being a meal or meat, right? And because you did it, that therefore becomes yours. And this is a very different approach to what constitutes property. The Judeo-Christian tradition is interesting because John Locke was a Christian, but he also had a secular case for rights in that same book. He had a case based in effect on the law of cause and effect. And I think the entire Judeo-Christian tradition that did give, to some extent, rise to America, did so not because of the particularly religious aspects of that tradition, but because of its secular aspects. And I can't make that argument here, but I think it's true. So I just wanted to put on the table that I wouldn't deny that Christians and Jews, primarily Christians in this country, were the people who came up with ideas that made this country what it is. There's no disputing that. But I think that the ideas they employed were not, at least certainly not exclusively or even substantially Christian ideas.
This is a rich topic, and thank you. Thank you, Craig. Really, really rich topic, and I can tell some people want to make responses, but in the interest of time, I do want to open it up for audience questions, so go ahead and begin lining up. Keep your questions very brief and concise, please, and make them questions, not statements. While we're lining up, I'm going to go ahead with another question for the group, and I guess we'll have to do a speed round with this one, although it's kind of a deep one. We know that the anti-human, anti-flourishing ideas out there are the root of these problems, and that pro-human, pro-flourishing ideas are the antidote. So what can the pro-flourishing movement do to better get these ideas across, and what can everyone hearing this do to help? Anyone who wants it, go for it.
Build new things. Build new things. Don't rely on legacy institutions. Don't rely upon the things we used to trust, like NPR and the New York Times.
Craig is speaking.
Mike, please. There
go.
we go. All right.
Sleep goes on.
I'll be very brief on this, but it's a big ask. I think that what we really need to do is for everyone who wants to flourish to learn how to bridge the is-ought gap or the fact-value gap. And Ayn Rand did it, and here it is in a nutshell. Values are certain kinds of facts. They're the facts, the goals, the things we need, the actions we need to take, those kinds of facts that support and sustain human life and help us to establish free societies so that we can live. And that is all secular, and it's all biologically based. The factual requirements of human life lie at the bottom of this, and that bridging of the is-ought gap is the most important thing, in my view, because you can't fight for flourishing if you can't argue the moral case for why you should be free to act on your judgment. Not only that freedom is moral, but that acting on your own interest, in your own interest, with your own judgment is morally correct, i.e. egoism. So if you can't bridge that gap, your whole argument for civilized society, in my view, is floating.
So I just want to get it clear. Did you say clergy?
Flourishing.
Oh, flourishing. Yeah, sorry. I mean, I agree with build new things. I agree with what you said, but I just want to add, build on what's already there. Ambiguity is okay up to a point. So promote moderation, but also promote clarity, and finally, not everything is material. So I think we have material flourishing, and yet we feel like we're in a state of crisis. So we've now got to take the trouble of trying to answer the immaterial, the questions of transcendence. And I think we can do it. I think some of us do it beautifully, but I think we need to get on with it.
Thank you. Yeah. We're going to go to audience questions. Looks like there we go. If possible, we could leave those on. It's not a problem with feedback. So we're going to go to Tom's question. And if you've got somebody in mind that you'd like to answer it, just let us know. If not, first person to grab it will grab it.
If I may, before we start the Q&A, I'd like to emphasize that please ask a question and try to keep it brief. I'd say 20 seconds for your question, because we would like to answer the questions, not have a speech from the mic. Thank you.
Absolutely. My question could be for any of you, and it concerns abortion, which naturally has come up quite a few times already today in this room. In terms of arguing that issue, what would you say are maybe one or two key points that you think that rationally minded people should be emphasizing in discussing with people that they disagree with in order to come to what you would consider the right conclusion regarding the right to choose an abortion?
I'm happy to take that one. So the issue of abortion rights centers around whether a fetus has rights, and that's the question. And you can't begin to answer that question until you know what rights are, where they come from, and how that's known. So this is an instance of what I mentioned earlier. And I recently wrote an article titled Abortion and the Questions We Must Answer. And the questions we must answer are the ones that I just named. And so people simply understanding the secular objective nature of rights, where they come from, and that is so important because it reverberates in all of the other discussions that we need to have. And literally, I think it's a waste of time for anybody to talk about abortion until they have figured that out. Because they're just using this term, they don't know what it means. Somebody says, fetuses have rights, women have rights. Well, okay, what are rights? Where do they come from? Do you know what that term means? If you don't, you're close to talking gibberish when you're using it. So that would be my thing, and it's a hot topic button, and it's never going to cease to be until people understand the answers to those questions.
Going to Ayaan for a follow-up? For a response?
On whether the fetus has rights or not, we are, I think, going to disagree until the end of times. What again makes Western civilization distinct for me from other civilizations is individual responsibility. Why is it always a woman's issue? Why is reproductive rights a women's issues? Why don't you, as a male, try and answer the question, should I conceive a child? What is my responsibility in this? I think that is easier to achieve than to get into that cosmic idea of do fetuses have rights. Reproductive rights are not only women's rights, they're also men's rights. Don't get a woman pregnant if you don't want that pregnancy.
This is a really important issue.
Yeah,
we're going to
so I'm
linger
sorry
on
to take
for
the
a
time,
minute.
but I do think it's
Yeah.
important, and that's the moral answers. And then on top of the moral answers is the constitutional question that was before the court. And you asked what's the one thing that I wish people would know, and I'll mention this because I did hear somebody say this earlier, that this is a 10th Amendment or a states' rights issue, and that is completely false. No matter what you think about abortion, that is not correct. And the reason why is because the 10th Amendment says that states have the authority to legislate on things that the federal Constitution does not take off the table for them. Federal Constitution comes in and says there are things that the federal government can do and there are things the states cannot do, and anything that's not addressed here, the states can do, right? The 14th Amendment, which comes after the 10th, says states cannot legislate in ways that do certain things. They can't take away private property without just compensation. They can't take away your freedom of speech. They can't take away liberty without due process of law. And so the constitutional question is, putting aside, if you can, the question of whether there is a moral right to abortion or not, the question is this within the state's authority to legislate? And so saying, well, this is a 10th Amendment issue is begging the question. Because the question is, does the 14th Amendment take this power away from the states or not? So saying it's a 10th Amendment issue misses the point, because the 10th Amendment was before the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment then takes away from the states the power to do certain things. And the question before the court today was, does the 14th Amendment take away from states the authority to legislate on abortion? And there's disagreements between people on that, but that's the issue. It cannot be dismissed as simply a matter of, well, this is a matter for the states. No, that's the question that's the issue. Is this a matter of states or not? If you think that it's a liberty that is protected by the Constitution, then the 10th Amendment doesn't apply. So.
You also don't believe that the Supreme Court or the court or any court should be legislating. So if it is not a matter for the states, then it's a matter for Congress. So I think in this, just legally speaking, I think it's a good thing for the courts to give back to the lawmakers and say, you sort it out.
With great respect, I disagree, and that is because the Fifth Amendment...
So the court should be legislating?
No, it is the role of the court to say what the law is, and when the law takes that power away from Congress, Congress has no authority to legislate. So the Fifth Amendment also says Congress can't take away your liberty without due process of law. So once again, it is not necessarily a matter for Congress. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect us against Congress. So if this is a constitutional right, then no, Congress cannot legislate on it.
But why are you assuming that it's a constitutional
right? I'm not. I'm trying not to assume that. I'm
Let's-
saying if it is the case that it's a constitutional right, then Congress cannot take that authority away.
I see the culture now rife with envy and resentment of achievement, especially coming from the people who are woke. And I wondered if you agree and if you think it's related to their desire to be primitive.
We're related to what?
Their desire to go back to the primitive.
Wokeism it's a romantic idea. I mean, we've all talked about it, but I think one thing that you've raised is for all emancipation movements to have a place, and again, the story of emancipation is distinctly Western. The story and the narratives of emancipation were struggles for fairness. And some groups made it struggles for vengeance. And I think we have these things now intertwined because if you listen closely to the wokist narratives, or the Marxist or neo-Marxist narratives, these are narratives of vengeance. They were on top. Now I want to be on top. I want to have the power to punish them. Come what may, irrationally. They have a white skin, they're the oppressors, intersectionality, nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. I just want I want revenge. That's basically what they're telling us. When you cut through all that nonsense about justice, if they really want justice, if they want real fairness, then we are not talking about destroying the institutions that we've so carefully built. We're talking about reforming. We're talking about tweaking. We're talking about what is it that is improved that we're leaving for the next generation. And I think a great deal of that rests on the shoulders of women.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We could have this conversation all day. It's been such an honor to be up here with all of you. You are my heroes, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for being a part of TOSCON. And
I hope you enjoyed that, and I invite you to join us for Level Up 2023 in Phoenix, Arizona, June 21 through 24. Speakers include Barry Weiss, Timothy Sandefur, Eric Daniels, and many more voices of reason. For information and to register, visit levelupconferences.org or click the link below. See you in Phoenix.